Talk Tuesday. Hi,
Hello.
everybody.
Cool.
Hello.
We have a very special guest with us today. We have Junilla Sledziewski. Now, Junilla is everything real estate. She's worked in the area from complex multi-party litigation all the way down to a contract review, somebody who wants to buy or sell a house or a piece of investment property. Now, Junilla founded Kirshner and Sledziewski in 2017, where she continues her passion in practicing real estate and helping her clients come up with good solutions and informed decisions. Now, according to Junilla, there's no matter that's too complicated or too small for a thorough and thoughtful review. And when I think of Junilla, I think of her tagline sometimes, which is the law practiced smartly. Now, Junilla, welcome to Talk Tuesday.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you, and we're glad to talk about real estate. Now, we put on our website that some people don't want to divorce.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
And we've lost her.
Do you work with people who are in the process of divorce?
There we go.
Yeah, I typically come in when there is a real estate asset involved. So I don't handle divorces, of course, but if people own property as husband and wife, or if perhaps one spouse owns property that they need to convey to the other spouse as part of a marital settlement, then I would be involved in the transfer process to transfer the property.
I always find it to be a bad idea when the parties decide that they're going to own the property together, even after the divorce. And I'm like,
yeah, I would agree with you there.
I frown on it, but
Yeah.
they seem so like, especially when there's a child, maybe child's 15 or whatever. They're like, well, we'll just own it for like 3 years and then we'll sell. I'm like,
yeah.
So what do you
Especially
suggest
now.
that they do in situations like that?
Yeah. Well, what I would suggest they do is we call it a joint property agreement or a joint tenant agreement. It's essentially, and I think of it almost as like a prenuptial agreement. It's an agreement of what will happen with this particular property going forward. So maybe designating that the spouse who's residing in the property is primarily responsible for the mortgage and the taxes and the insurance, but the other spouse will contribute to, or ex-spouse, I should say, would contribute to like maintenance or long-term capital improvements and that sort of thing. So you can really parse out what each person is going to be responsible for if they're just going to simply own the property as co-tenants rather than husband and wife. And especially, when parties they've had maybe a contentious divorce or something like that, it's really important to have all of that detailed out in a written document that you can look to for guidance in the event that there's some kind of dispute over who's supposed to pay for a new roof, for example.
What do you think, Jessica? Do you ever get that?
Yeah, but I never thought about putting an agreement in writing between the two people, because I'm imagining this is more along the lines of they're both going to be living there. Sometimes I see deals where only one person is living there, but the other person is maintaining the property, and then there's like a move out date. So in that situation, Junilla, would you do like a lease in addition to an MSA, or have you ever done anything like that before?
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a lease, but it is sort of just a different type of joint property agreement where you're designating like the move out date, and if the person doesn't move out, then perhaps they would owe some sort of financial consideration back to the other owner of the property. A lot of times people need and want to have a property sold by a certain date for other financial commitments that they have, and so sometimes if that doesn't happen in a timely fashion, there can be like trickle down consequences. So the more detail you can provide and protection you can give to the party that's maybe not residing in the property and it has less control, that's good. And possession, what do they say, like possession is 9/10 of the law or whatever. Like if you're in the property as the it's hard to get someone out of a property, unfortunately. I mean, people have this misconception that the sheriff will just come out and change the locks. Well, that's not how it works. Particularly if you are on the title or if you have some sort of ownership interest in it as a spouse or a former spouse. So you just, you have to be looking out for all of the possible ways you can protect someone who's not physically in possession of the property.
Jan, have you ever heard any stories about people trying to get each other out without using the sheriff?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Loaded,
We've had,
loaded question.
yeah, we've had some litigation involving that, and I've seen landlords think that that's what they need to do. They can just come and throw a padlock on the door, and that takes care of that. And of course, like Junilla says, there is a forcible entry and detainer act that has to be followed. And as a matter of fact, if you have a kid, like a 20-year-old kid living in your basement, and you're like, get out, I think you still have to follow a forcible entry and detainer. Is that right?
Technically, yes. I mean, you're supposed to, because you would be considered like a month-to-month oral lease, and that would, be enforceable. And if, as you may know, in Cook County, it's very, very favorable for tenants. And, the tenant who gets a hold of like a tenant's rights attorney will be able to stay in the property for a very, very long time. And, if you're talking about a married couple, like you can't evict your spouse because they have a homestead or an ownership interest in the real estate, whether they're on title or not. If that's the marital home, they have interest in the property. That can't just be, solved through simply evicting them.
What is that homestead you're talking about?
Yeah, so the homestead is, there's sort of two types of homestead. There's a homestead exemption that we get on our taxes, which you get, if you own your property as your home, you get some exemption on your taxes. But what I'm referring to is essentially the right of each spouse to an ownership interest in the property. It's an old act from the 1800s that was sort of designed to protect the family unit and protect the spouses from each other's debts. So the way that the law developed was to protect women from a spouse, a husband perhaps, who was, out running up credit card debts or gambling debts or something like that, and then getting a lien on the house and essentially stripping the family of all of its nest eggs. So the law was designed to basically say spouses cannot convey or have a lien placed on the marital home if the debt is only the debt of one spouse. So like a modern day example would be like a wife who goes out or a husband who goes out and has like a shopping spree and spends, $100,000 on credit cards, and the credit card company comes to try to collect. Well, if that was solely the wife's or husband's debt, the credit card company cannot take the marital home to satisfy the debt. It would be exempt because it's the homestead, and again, we want to protect that marital property in the home unit. So it's an interesting law how it developed, but the idea being that, A, it's not easy to kick out one or the other spouse from the house, and B, you don't have a situation where one spouse is maybe going and taking out a mortgage on the property without telling the other spouse, or incurring debts or judgments that could be have negative consequences for the good spouse, if you will.
This isn't really on topic, but I just want to know, how is the real estate market now with the COVID? Is it coming back, or commercial's good, but the businesses aren't, or?
Yeah, I would say residential's pretty, in terms of our busyness level, it's pretty on par for a normal year. It's a little starting to slow down a little bit right now, just because, there's kind of a big rush before the school season starts. And then now that everyone's kind of in school, it quiets down because everyone wants to move before they start their new schools, right? But commercial, I think, is going to be seeing a lot of struggles in the upcoming years, especially when it comes to office type space. I've unfortunately had to counsel a lot of landlords and tenants who, either the tenant just quit paying, or the tenant moved out, or, the landlord's in a tough situation. If they maybe own a hair salon or some other type of business that was put out for several months, those renters, those tenants of commercial properties are having a really challenging time. And there's been a lot of really tough conversations around those topics. But I think, a lot of people are moving because they want more space and they want outdoor space. But I wouldn't say that there's like, I haven't seen like a mad rush out of downtown or anything like that. I know sales in the suburbs are really up due to, obviously there's more space out there. So it's, it's still moving. It's just kind of moving in different directions than we're used to.
I was wondering if, when you're talking about holding the title, what's the best way, number one, for a married couple to hold the title? And what happens to that title during the process of a divorce? Anything?
Yeah, so a married couple, as long, if it's the marital home where they intend to reside as their primary residence, they should 99.9% of times be taking title as what we call as joint tenants by the entirety, or tenants by the entirety. And that is the only title protection that will give that protection that I was speaking about from the debts of one or the other spouse. So as long as a married couple is holding property as tenants by the entireties, they'll be protected from each other's debts. Now, that's not joint debt. If they take out a mortgage together, or they incur some gambling debt, for example, together, then that would, that's different. But that's only available to married couples. So like if you buy a property with a business colleague or with a friend, you're not eligible for that same protection. So it's really, really unique to marital or to couples, and it's very important for like that protection of the family unit. So when you are going through a divorce, typically I imagine one or the other spouse is going to keep the property, maybe if there's children involved, or perhaps they want to sell the property, just get rid of it and move on. So in either case, so for example, if they sell the property, once the sale is complete, like there's no longer any title interest in that property. But if they are in a situation where one spouse maybe is going to keep the property and the other and buy out the other spouse, usually, ideally, the spouse that is remaining in the property should be the only person on title. And that's because they're the only person living in there, and the joint tenancy protection, the tenancy by the entirety protection would be like destroyed essentially at the date of the divorce. So sometimes what happens is like the divorce is finalized, but the property, the parties are still on the property together until maybe one or the other buys each other out. But while it would be titled as tenancy by the entireties, if they were to try to enforce that in any way, the court would say, well, you're tenants in common, because that unity of the marriage has been broken, and so now you just own it, like you each own like half the property basically. So the point being, when a divorce is complete, you need to typically retitle the property, which can depend on a number of factors how you do that, including whether you have to refinance the mortgage. If one spouse is buying out the other spouse, they may need to refinance, and all of that has to happen in connection with changing the title.
You still want the right of survivorship though. So can you refile it into just joint tenancy and not tenancy in the entirety?
So yeah, you'd have two options. You could refile into joint tenancy with the right of survivorship. But if you do that, then say the wife is living in the property and she passes away, well, the husband would automatically then inherit the property, or the ex-husband, I should say. So if that's fine with everyone, then that's fine. But if there are other estate planning considerations, or that property should be going to the ex-wife's estate, then we need to make sure that it's held as tenants in common. And tenants in common is basically you kind of have to think of it as each person owns literally half the house. It's 50%. And if the wife who's living in the house dies, her 50% interest will come to her estate, and then the husband's 50% will, stay with him. And then you basically have to work it out in the estate court to, figure out, are we going to sell the property, or is he going to now buy it back? There's a lot of different
I would think that would be a nightmare to do it that way. Mm-hmm. If it's the intent of us to sell the house in 3 years, and we're going to split it, and then the divorce gets rid of the tenancy in the entirety with the right of survivorship and it just goes to tenants in common, then you could potentially be fighting whoever half of your house just went to.
Yep, exactly. So it's very important to, you know, kind of look at it from an estate planning perspective too when you're finalizing all of that, because, you know, even if the intent, like you said, is to hold the property, like if somebody has an accident or, you know, dies before that 3 years comes, you could really have a mess on your hands. And there are a few ways to deal with that, either through using a land trust or doing what we call a transfer on death instrument, which you can record on the property and designate, like the parties could agree, okay, if, you know, on death of one or of both of us, then the property goes to, you know, a particular person. So, you know, all of that needs to kind of be evaluated at the conclusion of a divorce or during, you know, part of the process, that it's clear what should happen to the value of that property if someone passes away. Which is why it's probably usually better to just sell the property and start fresh. But like you, to your point, you know, I'm sure you see that for the consideration of the children and family, like they want to a lot of times keep that home for the kids and stuff. So you know, there's a lot to consider.
Right.
Well, I know when you sell real estate, you have all these things that go along with it, right? Like your fixtures and the pipes and everything that goes into real estate. And we had a case one time, Kim, do you remember that? Where somebody went in and they were moving out of the house because the other spouse was moving in, and they took the pipes, well, yeah, we got the dead fish too. But I mean, remember that they took like the insides of the house and the white.
I think that was Laura's case, and the woman came in and removed the windows and like every piece of the house. So when he came, it was like a shell. And we were like, oh my God.
Air conditioning units, heating, hot water heaters, it was all gone.
Yeah. Or the case where the fish was left in the fridge and then unplugged.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, real estate is so crazy anyway. I mean, there's always something with these closings that you're like, okay. I mean, I've had people like take doorknobs off the doors and, you know, so I can imagine in a divorce, it's just even, you know, they can't, so a lot of times they can't even agree on like the realtor to list the property. Then you have to have two realtors. So it's
right.
What if they want to keep it? I mean, they want to get a divorce, but they don't want to divorce their house. They want to keep their house. Do you work with people like that? Is it something that you can help them keep the house? Are there strategies available to be able to be the one to keep the house?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely, you know, like if they want to keep the property, and assuming they're not going to live together since they're divorced, but you know, they want to keep, you know, maybe they've got some good equity that they want to keep building, the house is in a good location and they see it as an asset, you know, they can certainly own it jointly, but you just want to make sure that you take into account their estate plan and their long-term goals with the property, and make sure that who's, you know, like I was talking about earlier, whichever ex-spouse is not going to be in possession of the property is equally protected. And then also that the spouse who does have possession is not, you know, maybe like bearing more expense than they should, right? Like if they're both going to benefit from like an increase in the equity in the home in the long term, like they should probably both be contributing to maintenance and capital projects and things like that. Maybe who's ever living there pays the mortgage, they both pay the taxes. I mean, you have to think about all of that and see what they can agree on. And there's certainly ways to, you know, strategize it as part of a larger overall estate plan. I really like land trusts as well. That's a way to hold title that keeps the names of the parties off of the public records. And so it can be very useful, particularly if people, you know, high earners, doctors, athletes, you know, people that are concerned with privacy. This is a really great way to protect that, you know, their privacy. And then in a divorce, it's very easy to transfer property when you have it in a land trust. You don't have to do a sale to change the title owners. So it's, you know, it's a pretty inexpensive option, and it really creates a lot of flexibility for that property. And you can, like, you know, like if we're talking about retitling something, you know, to use some of the examples, like maybe at the time of the divorce and then maybe a few years down the line, we're changing it again. A land trust, all you do is file an amendment to the trust with, so it's like very, very straightforward. And it just makes it a lot easier to change the ownership of the property.
Does it protect you from creditors having your house in a land trust?
Well, it does in the sense that, like, say, for example, if you cause an accident, somebody, is critically injured and they go out and hire an attorney to sue you, the very first thing those attorneys are going to do is run a property record search to see if you own real estate, because that means that, you have assets to pay for, their ultimate judgment. So setting aside like whether there's insurance coverage or whatever. So if they go and like type in your name to public records and your property is held in a land trust, they won't be able to find you. So it just creates like an extra hurdle, and it can maybe dissuade somebody from suing you or targeting you if, again, it tends to be more like high earners, public figures, athletes, and politicians, people like that. They should all have their properties in the land trust because they're always targets of these lawsuits. And this could go for investment property or, the family home too. So.
What about us trying to find his assets? Like if we had suspicion that he had property, and we couldn't find it,
Mm-hmm.
but other than, obviously asking him, but no way to find it then either on our end?
No, not if it's, held in a land, like if you know that he lives at such and such an address and you look up that address and it's held in a land trust, you could maybe like assume that he is the beneficiary of the land trust. But to go through the court proceedings and get some sort of charging order against the land trustee to disclose who's behind the property, by then he could have handed it over to a family member or done any number of things without anyone really knowing. So it's not, to really answer the question of whether it will protect you, it's not foolproof, but it just creates like more of a hurdle. And as you probably know, like the plaintiff's attorneys often work on a contingency. So if they're, not real incentivized to file a frivolous lawsuit because there's no assets to collect, they might just like let it go. So, it's not foolproof. I always say the best thing you can have is a good insurance policy, but it doesn't hurt to have that extra layer of protection.
Well, it sounds like you could transfer ownership under this land trust pretty easily. What if you have your home in a land trust and you're married? Can my spouse just transfer it to somebody else? Isn't there a mortgage tied to it that has to be notified or changed?
Yeah, so if you have the property held in a land trust and it's held jointly by, so the way it works is like the land trust holds the title, but then like the husband and wife would be the beneficiaries of the land trust as tenants by the entireties. So in order for there to be any transfer of the title, the land trustee would require both spouses to sign off on that. So you still have that same protection of the homestead where the land trustee is not going to, they shouldn't, right? I mean, weird things happen, but the land trustee should not execute any document that would transfer the property without the consent of both spouses. Now, if they were tenants in common, that's different. They might be allowed to do it. So you have to, it's kind of like two layers of title. The land trust is like what the public sees, but then behind that, there's a private agreement that says, who owns what and what percentage and that sort of thing. But a married couple, it would still always be by the entireties.
What's the cost usually associated with establishing and maintaining a land trust?
So I usually charge if I do it in connection with the closing, which usually is the recommended way, that you just close from the beginning in the land trust. It's about $700 in legal fees. And then there's a yearly fee for the trust. It's like $100 and maybe like $300 or $400 to the trust company to set up the trust. So maybe like $1,000 up front and then about $100 a year after that.
Okay, now people are listening and they're like, okay, I need to know how my house is held. Where do I get that information?
Well, if you're like, I want, yeah, you can look it up with the Cook County. If it's in Cook County, you can go to the Recorder of Deeds website and you can punch in your address and see if you're able to find your property. Usually if you have the PIN number, that's the best way. And so sometimes it's very clear, and you can find it easily. Other times the county recorder leaves some things to be desired in terms of searchability, so you may not find it that easily. But if you are very interested, I can certainly run like a formal title search, which involves searching the actual hard property records to see if you're on title or who's on title of a property.
So if you want to change the title, have you ever seen I Love Lucy, where they take the white tape and they just put it across the living room or up and down I mean, that's really dividing property, isn't it?
Yeah, if only it was that simple.
That doesn't change the title, I guess.
No. I mean, I had, like, to give you an example, I had a couple that bought a property before they got married together. So they owned it as joint tenants with the right of survivorship, but then they split up prior to the wedding. And so, she wanted to keep the property and he wanted to sell. And because of it, them not being married, it's a little more complicated. And he would have had to essentially like take her to court and do like what's called a partition action, which basically try to force her to sell her interest. So it gets messy, but they didn't have any kind of agreement in place that said, all right, if we break up, we're going to sell the property, or she can stay or he can stay, and how they would divide up their costs that they shared when they bought the property. So it can get pretty messy if you don't pre-plan. I'm sure, like, for you, recommending prenuptial agreements is really probably cuts down a lot of the trouble later. And so we recommend something similar if you're buying property with somebody who's not your spouse.
And that's just a contract, right? There's no litigation involved. It's just a simple contract between two people.
Right, exactly. And it can be very simple. I mean, some people are very agreeable and they have a plan already in place, and other people, we provide more counseling to help them understand, like, okay, well, here are your options, and this is like plans that we recommend, like how to split things up and how to handle those situations if they come up. And then it just creates a deterrent later. Like if there is a dispute, the agreement could perhaps say that, like, whoever loses the case, if there's a dispute, would have to pay the other's attorney's fee. So you can create incentives for people to just try to work it out. I'm sure, as you see when you're in a breakup or divorce situation, it's sometimes very difficult to have people agree on anything. But if it's something that, is pre-exists and it's clear, and they know that they're not going to win in court if they try to challenge what they had agreed on previously, it can really help cut down on, unnecessary litigation later.
So if you're in the process of a divorce and your house is now closing because you've got a buyer, luckily, each side, do they need their own real estate lawyer, or does that real estate lawyer can represent them both because they're really looking out for both of their interests, or is it better to have two?
It depends. I would say, like, I've done it both ways. I have represented both. Usually we would ask that they waive any conflict. If it's not really contentious, like a really contentious divorce, and we can all kind of agree, it's usually fine. I have had situations where, the husband and wife cannot speak to each other, and so they do each have to have their own counsel, and then, it's the lawyers going back and forth more, and it's more complicated, it's more expensive, but sometimes that has to be done for sure. So,
because are their interests like adverse at times at a real estate closing? I mean, they both want the highest price,
right,
pay the least amount of fees. What else is there?
Right. So sometimes, like, what will happen if the property is sitting on the market, maybe one spouse says, well, it's been sitting for 6 months, we need to drop the price. And the other spouse says, well, no, we don't. Let's keep it, another month or two and see what happens. Like, so there's,
We usually build that into our agreements.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, usually, hopefully, you pre-plan like sort of a descending price point, right? Depending on how long the property sits on the market. And so that there is no room for those like petty not always petty, but disagreements later that just get so, you know, they really like cause more problems and solutions. So like, to your point, everyone just wants a house to sell, but like some may have a lower tolerance for letting it sit on the market than the other, especially if they need cash, and that sort of thing. So
Sure. How do people reach you, Junilla, if they want to get a hold of you and have some questions about real estate?
Yeah, all kinds of ways. You can email me. My email is just my first name, Junilla at kslawchicago.com. On my website, there's a like page where you can just send a note. You can check out my social media. It's Junilla ESQ. You can text me, call me, 312-252-9777. All of it's on the website as well. So we do complimentary consultations for, you know, a variety of issues. So happy to chat with anybody who's interested in learning more about any of the topics today.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's
always
fun.
good to learn a little something.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting facets of this stuff, and you know, it's always changing, and every situation is a little different. You know, every closing, there's always something, right? So it's really important that you have legal representation throughout the process, both with the divorce and ultimately when you do sell a property or buy a new property.
Right. Good.
All right. Well, thank you for all things real estate. We appreciate all your knowledge and look forward to seeing you when we could get together again. And until then, be safe.